In a house near the Bois de Boulogne, the crystal sparkled, the dogs were spoiled, the servants moved like clockwork, and the woman who had once helped topple a king kept a little gold notebook by her plate to grade every dinner. Staff called it the grumble book. After each meal, they opened it to find her written assessments. The wines paired incorrectly, a sauce too sharp, a pastry not quite right, a dish a guest had particularly enjoyed. Nothing escaped notation. The footmen wore royal livery. Guests arrived at 8:45 precisely, sat to dinner at 9:15, and soup was never served, because Wallace reportedly said that after cocktails, soup was just another drink. The strangest guest at that table wasn't a king or a duchess. He was a Woolworth heir named Jimmy Donahue, and he came for both of them. By the time Jimmy Donahue became a fixture in the Windsor household in the early 1950s, the couple the world called history's great romance had been in exile for 15 years. Edward VIII had abdicated the British throne on December 10, 1936, to marry a twice-divorced American woman, a sacrifice so total, so operatic, that Life magazine would eventually call it the romance of the century. Edward himself had framed it from a radio broadcast heard around the world. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." That line became the whole story. It was carved in stone in people's minds before the decade was out. The Paris exile was what came after, and after is what this story is actually about. Wallace Simpson was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, a summer resort town near the Maryland border where Baltimore families escaped the heat. Her father was Teakle Wallace Warfield, from a family described by one historian as a staid presence in Maryland society. Old-name gentry, the kind who had reputation without always having the money that should accompany it. He died of tuberculosis before Wallace was a year old, leaving her mother and infant daughter financially dependent on extended Warfield relations, particularly her father's wealthy bachelor brother, Solomon Davies Warfield of the Continental Trust Company. This was the specific formation the rest of her life grew from. The Warfield family had standing, but not security. Wallace learned, in the drawing rooms of Baltimore and at the Oldfield School, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland, whose fees her uncle paid, how to navigate old money society from a position of precarious means. She became friends there with heiress Renee DuPont and Mary Kirk, whose family founded Kirk Silverware. A fellow pupil recalled later that she was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did. She was always immaculately dressed. She pushed herself. A later biographer wrote that her quick wits, vitality, and capacity for total concentration on her interlocutor ensured that she had many admirers. That phrase, total concentration on her interlocutor, is the key. Not charm in the easy, showy sense, something more calculated and more useful. The ability to make the person across from her feel like the only person in the room. She learned to listen, to assess while appearing merely to be amused, to notice the social temperature of a room without appearing to take its measure. These were skills honed out of necessity. They became, eventually, her most powerful instrument. Her first marriage, to U.S. Navy officer Win Spencer in 1916, was marked by his heavy drinking and their repeated separations. It ended in divorce. Her second marriage, to Anglo-American shipping executive Ernest Simpson in 1928, was more stable but increasingly strained. By the early 1930s, the Simpsons were, as one account puts it plainly, living beyond their means and had to let staff go. Wallace was 46 years old from a social standpoint, the right connections, the visible surface of the right life. and underneath it, financial uncertainty she had navigated since childhood. Then came January 1931. The country house was Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire, a hunting property belonging to Marmaduke Furness, whose wife, Lady Thelma Furness, was, at the time, the Prince of Wales's mistress. Thelma invited the Simpsons as last-minute chaperones because her original guests couldn't make it at the last minute due to a family illness. That's the meeting the legend later inflated into something preordained. Wallis reportedly had a cold. By some accounts, she wasn't at her sharpest that weekend, which may have made her seem less calculating, more genuinely herself, less the studied Baltimore socialite, more simply a woman at a country house party who happened to be funny and direct. What happened afterward wasn't a thunderclap. The Simpsons became regular visitors at Fort Belvadier, Edward's private retreat in Windsor Great Park, but the relationship deepened gradually, over years, not days. Fort Belvedere is the detail that tells you something true about Edward. George V gave him the lease in 1929, a Gothic revival folly on Shrubs Hill, overlooking Virginia Water, about 22 miles from London. When Edward asked for it, his father reportedly looked at him with some amusement and said, "What could you possibly want that queer old place for? Those damn weekends, I suppose." Then he gave permission. Edward later wrote that he loved it as he loved no other material thing, perhaps because it was so much my own creation. He described how when he first encountered it, the half-buried beauty of the place leaped to my eye, and he set about transforming it from what he called a pseudo-Gothic hodgepodge into something he could call home. He built a swimming pool between 1931 and 1932, replacing the old lily pond. He added a tennis court, stables, central heating, bathrooms adjacent to nearly every room. He put in steam rooms, showers, built-in cupboards, modern conveniences still rare in British homes at the time. He landscaped obsessively, planting roses and irises along the battlement walls, building a rock garden with cascading water pumped up from Virginia Water, getting weekend guests, including his brother Bertie, the future George VI, to help him haul shrubbery and clear undergrowth in the evenings. Prime Minister Baldwin, visiting during the abdication crisis, reportedly stood in the garden and complimented Edward on the silvery radiance of the birch trees and the delicacy of the autumn tints. Even at the worst political moment of his life, Edward was still a man who had made a garden. The weekends he hosted there were built for amusement first. Guests included, as the record has it, courtiers and diplomats, American men of affairs, and English society, garnished with a sprinkling of statesmen, soldiers, and sailors. The company was deliberately mixed, the atmosphere deliberately looser than the conventions of the royal household demanded. Chips Channon, the diarist whose uncensored volumes, published in full in 2021, remain the most acute social document of the period, wined and dined Edward and Wallis in the months before the abdication, and observed the court around them at close range. The same Channon who noted, in his diary in November 1936, that Edward appeared to be drifting toward authoritarian sympathies, pro-German, skeptical of democracy, and increasingly indifferent to what he saw as its inefficiencies. Sharp-eyed, merciless, and at close quarters, Channon noticed what those around Edward consistently noticed. He was restless, easily bored, and dependent on company that could keep a room alive. He was charming, genuinely so, but the charm required constant feeding. Someone always had to keep the party going. His official biographer later put it plainly. By the end of 1934, Edward had become slavishly dependent on Wallis. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It's not romantic dependence only. It's structural dependence. She was the person who made the room work, who managed his entertaining, handled the difficult guests, held the social machinery together with the same focused attention she'd trained in Baltimore drawing rooms. After the abdication, after the exile, the room got very small. Edward had traded Fort Belvadier for permanent displacement, and Wallis had traded the prospect of a throne for a title she was officially denied. George VI refused her the style Royal Highness that her husband held. They married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France. The war years came. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1940, a posting widely understood as a means of keeping him far from Europe and from any Nazi connections the British government preferred not to examine too closely, and they stayed until 1945. The amusement, such as it was, had to be manufactured wherever they landed. By 1953, when they took up the lease at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement on the northern edge of the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, the exile had become permanent. The city of Paris offered the villa, a substantial neoclassical mansion, at a peppercorn rent, reportedly as little as $50 a year. Some accounts put it closer to 10. In addition, the French government exempted the Windsors from income tax and from duty on foreign purchases through the British Embassy. Their personal fortune at the time was approximately £3 million. They had a country house they'd actually bought, Le Moulin de la Tuileries, outside Versailles, purchased in 1952 with funds released by the British government. Yet somehow, as the financial history records plainly, they lived very well on other people's generosity. The Villa Windsor was what they made of that generosity, and Wallis made it extraordinary. She hired Stéphane Boudin of Maison Janssen to oversee the decoration, and she worked alongside him herself. They spent whole days scouring Paris together for fine antiques and furnishings. The entrance hall gleamed with marble and an eclectic mix of Chinese and French objects, placed precisely to lead the eye upward toward the sweeping staircase. Over the galleried landing hung Edward's red and gold silk banner, embroidered with the royal coat of arms, the same banner that had flown at Windsor Castle, relocated now to a leased villa in the 16th arrondissement. A trompe-l'oeil depicted the Duke's garter banner on another wall. Draped across the Duke's bed upstairs was an antique tapestry embroidered with the royal coat of arms, and his bed cover bore the monogram E.R., Edward Rex, a reminder of his 11-month reign. Portraits of the Duke in his garter robes, portraits of his mother, Queen Mary, who steadfastly refused to ever visit or receive her daughter-in-law, hanging on the walls of the house she would never enter. The dining room was paneled in chinoiserie, pavilions, gardens, bridges, taken from a chateau at Chanteloup. Its blue scrubbed with wire brush and glazed and the color rubbed in dry, so the paneling seemed to absorb and release light depending on the candles and the hour. 2 round tables rather than one long rectangular one, because Wallis preferred that arrangement. It meant every guest could see and speak to every other. 2 footmen per table during service. The linens by Porto were embroidered to match the porcelain dinnerware. Individual butter pots with porcelain-handled knives. Multiple types of bread at each place. Multiple types of bread. Society figures who dined there recalled being bewildered by the quantity of cutlery and tableware, by the elaborate precision of it, so much at each place that the table seemed to declare itself a performance rather than a meal. No soup. Soup was, after cocktails, just another drink. The dogs, Cairn Terriers and pugs, had the run of the house. The Duke fed them from little silver bowls. He was easier with the dogs than with most people by the end. They required nothing of him except presence, and presence was the one thing he could still provide without the full weight of the court bearing down. Wallis's bedroom was done in turquoise, a shade she called Wallis blue, against which a red Persian rug made a striking contrast. Between her room and the Duke's was a comfortable sitting room, cozy, informal, for evenings when close friends were invited upstairs after dinner, away from the formal salon. The Duke's room was dominated by military objects and royal heraldry, and by pictures of Wallis, stacked on every available surface from the bedside to the desk, as one description has it. He didn't regret, at least not that. The staff numbered somewhere between 12 and 15, sources vary, including a French chef of professional distinction and a Scottish housekeeper, the footmen in royal livery. Sidney Johnson, the Duke's valet, so embedded in the household that when Mohammed Al-Fayed took over the lease after Wallace's death in 1986, Johnson stayed on to help curate the restoration. One requirement held throughout: staff were to address Wallis as Your Royal Highness, the title she was officially denied. They weren't permitted to speak French to her. And then there was the gold notebook. Not just at the dinner table. A New York Times account from 2011 notes that Wallis sometimes wore a tiny gold notebook on a chain around her wrist during the day, using it to jot instructions as they came to her. At meals, she kept the gold-encased notepad beside her plate, where it sat as an object of quiet authority, visible to everyone at the table but belonging only to her. Wallis's own 1949 Vogue piece, written in her own voice, published under her own name, confirmed the system. She kept a record of every dinner she hosted, a complete account of guest lists, menus, seating arrangements, which china and silver had been used, how the table had been decorated, which dishes the guests had particularly enjoyed. Personally, she wrote, I considered 10 the ideal number for dinner, so that all guests could be seated close enough for general conversation across both tables. She considered 10 the ideal number. The precision is the point. In a life stripped of institutional power, stripped of political consequence, stripped of the royal machinery that had briefly surrounded her, Wallace Simpson ran her dinner table with the exacting discipline of a general managing a campaign. The gold notebook isn't a charming eccentricity. It's a woman performing control over the only territory she still governed. There was, of course, nothing left to govern that mattered. By the 1950s, the Windsor allure had worn thin. The stain of their pre-war sympathy toward Germany never entirely lifted. In Paris, they were more often than not surrounded by social climbers and sycophants, rather than anyone of genuine consequence. One guest said entering the villa was like stepping into a fairyland of fantastic luxury. The visitors who said that were generally not people whose approval changed anything. The grandeur of the Villa Windsor answered a hunger for the appearance of importance, while the substance had been gone for years. Into this airless situation, in April 1941, walked the Donahue family. The Windsors were in Palm Beach, traveling from the Bahamas, when they were received at Cielito Lindo, the Palm Beach estate of Jessie Woolworth Donahue. Jessie was the youngest of the 3 daughters of Frank Winfield Woolworth, the man who founded the 5 and 10 retail chain that bore his name. Her husband's background, an Irish-American family whose fortune derived from the retail butcher's fat rendering company, had not overcome the new money stigma in Palm Beach society, no matter how extravagantly they spent. James Paul Donahue Sr. had died by suicide on April 23, 1931, heavily in debt from gambling and spending, leaving an estate of under $1.8 million net, including 46,550 shares of Woolworth common stock. His sons inherited the Woolworth connection, not his debts. The family money remained concentrated in Jessie. Her elder son, Woolworth Wooly Donahue, appealed to the Duke. The Duchess was drawn to the younger one. James Paul Donahue Jr., Jimmy, was born on June 11, 1915, in Greenwich, Connecticut. He had attended the Hun School at Princeton, then Choate, from which he was expelled at 17 for non-attendance. What happened after expulsion tells you everything about the kind of life his mother's money made possible. He took tap dance lessons from Bill Bojangles Robinson, the most celebrated tap dancer in America, and then debuted as a dancer in a Broadway musical production that closed shortly after its opening. He was 18. He never held regular employment again. He traveled the world staying at expensive hotels with a valet in attendance, flying planes, speaking multiple languages, French certainly, possibly others, spending the years between that Broadway failure and the Windsor meeting, cultivating the specific social career available to a very rich American man with no professional obligations and substantial personal gifts. The gifts were real. He was handsome. He was multilingual. He could fly a plane. And he was, by every account from people who knew him, a brilliant conversationalist in the particular mode that requires a certain ruthlessness, the gossip who sees exactly what's absurd about a situation, the jokester who finds the one observation that deflates a pretension cleanly, the prankster who understands that the best joke leaves everyone laughing, including the target, at least until later. This kind of wit is a social weapon. It requires the practitioner to observe more carefully than anyone else in the room and to be willing to use what they observe. Jimmy Donahue was willing. Every source characterizes him the same way: magnetic, funny, generous, and when the occasion warranted, genuinely cruel. Liz Smith's San Francisco Chronicle summary of Wilson's book, published in January 2001, before the book had wide circulation, described him as someone who, like Lord Byron, was said to be mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Smith, who described herself as someone familiar with the Gilded Age the book depicted, said the account struck her as mostly accurate. He was also, by every authoritative source, gay. A gay man at a time when homosexual acts were illegal in the United States and in Britain, when press agents were required to arrange public appearances with female escorts to maintain cover, when the social exposure of this fact carried consequences that went far beyond scandal. Jimmy Donahue navigated this with the combination of wealth and recklessness that characterized everything else about him. The Wikipedia entry on James Paul Donahue Jr. is direct. Though press agents arranged for him to be seen with female escorts, his pursuits, until he met Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, were exclusively homosexual. Jessie Donahue's reaction to receiving the Duke and Duchess at Cielito Lindo in April 1941 was one of unvarnished delight. She was, per one historian's account of the Southampton social context, thrilled. Despite her millions, despite the Fifth Avenue triplex and the Palm Beach estate and the old Brookville property and the extravagant entertaining, Jessie Woolworth Donahue had never achieved what she actually wanted: the social standing that old European aristocracy could confer, and that American money alone couldn't purchase. When she and her husband had tried to break into Southampton society, the spending hadn't bought full acceptance. Now, here were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, sitting in her house, on her hospitality. The same historian called this a social coup of the first order, and noted that Jessie shamelessly put a nice chunk of her fortune at the Windsors' disposal, specifically naming jewels provided to Wallis and lavish entertainments and excursions for the trio as a whole. This is the mechanism the romantic version of the story consistently obscures. The arrangement was transactional from the beginning, and both parties understood it. Jessie Donahue and her son Jimmy got access to European aristocracy, specifically to what remained of the senior British royal line, the most prestigious social commodity available at any price in the post-war world. The Windsors got funded evenings. Jimmy, per Christopher Wilson's account, almost always paid restaurant and club bills himself. Jewels came from Jessie's direction. Travel was underwritten by the family's money. The Windsors, who managed their personal fortune carefully but maintained a lifestyle that strained against what their post-civil list income could realistically sustain, found in the Donahue arrangement a solution to a persistent problem. Edward's post-abdication annuity from his brother George VI was initially set at £25,000 per year. Substantial, but not lavish by the standards they wished to maintain. His memoir, A King's Story, published in 1951, and the pre-publication serialization in Life magazine had brought in significant income. But memoir money doesn't recur. The French government's peppercorn rent and tax exemptions helped. The Donahue money helped more visibly. What Jimmy himself was extracting from the arrangement is the question none of the biographers agree on. Wilson frames it as obsession, an attachment to Wallace that, whatever its precise form, consumed him. Andrew Morton, who wrote Wallace in Love, reportedly concluded that the relationship was in every respect but the physical, a love affair, and that Donahue's boasts about its physical nature were characteristic of his reputation for inventive pranks and rumor-mongering. One account, sourced to people who observed the trio together, describes Donahue treating Wallace like a young girl, giving her the experience of being courted, of being the object of pursuit, at a moment in her life when the Duke of Windsor, whose slavish dependence had long since curdled into something more like a weight she carried, could no longer provide anything of the kind. She had managed Edward for 20 years. Jimmy didn't need managing. Jimmy arrived already amused. The social world they occupied together in the early 1950s was specific and documented. Paris, New York, Palm Beach, Atlantic crossings. In May 1950, Christopher Wilson's narrative places Jimmy and the Windsors traveling together on the RMS Queen Mary from New York to France. Wallis was approximately 54 at the time. Jimmy was 35. Wilson places this voyage as the turning point in their relationship, the moment at which friendship became something else. His evidence for what occurred during or immediately after that crossing is contested, and seriously so. The evidentiary chain he offers runs from an unnamed maid in Barbara Hutton's household, who observed the state of bed linen, to Hutton's secretary, who relayed the observation to Wilson. Wilson himself called this the best source. He presented the maid as the most reliable witness available to him. Peter Kurth, reviewing the book for Salon in January 2001, wasn't kind about this. He described the book as something to be held at a distance with tongs, and addressed Wilson's evidentiary claim with a precision that has aged well. You can say any damn thing you want about them, and they can't do a thing. Wilson names no crucial sources. Kurth's larger assessment, that the Duchess's intense friendship with Donahue was one of the great open secrets of 50s cafe society, but that Wilson hasn't answered the question of whether they ever actually had sex, represents the most careful reading of what the book actually demonstrates versus what it claims. Dancing with the Devil remains the primary, dedicated biography of the Windsor-Donahue relationship, and it drove the popular conversation about what that relationship was. Its central claim, that a sexual affair occurred and lasted 4 years and 3 months, rests on sourcing that Wilson's critics found inadequate. Wilson also cites papers belonging to Anne Seagram, the Windsors' private secretary, in which the Duke reportedly accused Wallis of adultery and demanded she break off her relationship with Donahue. If accurate, those papers would be the most significant contemporary document in the entire question. They are accessible only through Wilson's representation of them, which is itself a single source for a claim that carries enormous weight. Charles Hyam, whose 1988 biography, The Duchess of Windsor, The Secret Life, was later retitled Mrs. Simpson, goes in a strikingly different direction. The Observer's 2001 review of Wilson's book notes that Hyam suggests it was the Duke, not the Duchess, with whom Jimmy Donahue had his royal fling, and adds immediately that it's impossible to corroborate this story. Hyam's work has drawn consistent criticism for sensationalism. His Kirkus Reviews notice described him as having a field day unearthing stories both startling and impossible to verify. Andrew Lowney, in Traitor King, takes the position that Wallis did have an affair with Donahue and that the Duke was humiliated by it, treating the matter as established. Andrew Morton accepts the emotional intimacy and disputes the physical consummation. 4 named biographers of the Windsors, 4 different positions on the nature of the relationship, ranging from flat reversal of its direction to confident assertion of a 4-year sexual affair to carefully hedged emotional truth. This disagreement isn't a failure of scholarship. It reflects the actual state of the evidence. What no one disputes is the El Morocco episode. On a New Year's Eve in the early 1950s, at El Morocco nightclub in New York, the room famous for its zebra-striped banquettes, its champagne and crowds, and the particular kind of celebrity that the late night, the right table, and the right companion could provide, Jimmy Donahue staged a scene. He seated the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on a zebra-striped throne and placed paper hats on their heads as mock crowns, to the delight and laughter of onlookers. Multiple accounts describe the Duke as humiliated. Andrew Lowney, in Traitor King, recounts it as one of the clearest examples of what the Donahue arrangement had reduced a former King of England to. A prop in someone else's performance, crowned with paper, at a club he couldn't afford to host, in front of an audience that was laughing at him. The man who had once said he found it impossible to discharge his duties without the support of the woman he loved was sitting on a nightclub throne, while a rich, gay American placed a paper hat on his head and took the laugh. Then there is Lady Pamela Hicks. Pamela Hicks is the daughter of Earl Mountbatten of Burma and a first cousin to the Duke of Windsor. She is the most credible named personal witness in this entire history, which makes her account the most important single piece of testimony. Per the Wikipedia entry on James Paul Donahue Jr., whose citation traces directly to Wilson's book, Lady Hicks endorsed Jimmy Donahue's claim of having had a 4-year affair with Wallis, and specifically recalled the Duke coming to her father in tears, saying, "Wallace is with Jimmy." She is described in multiple sources, including MEAWW and the Deseret News, as having verified Donahue's claim. Her account is worth holding carefully, because what it confirms and what it leaves open are different things. A first cousin witnessing a man in tears over his wife's relationship confirms that the Duke was in serious distress. It confirms that Wallace was spending time with Jimmy in circumstances that caused that distress. It confirms that people close to the situation understood something significant was happening. What it can't establish from the outside, what no one on the outside could establish, is exactly what being with Jimmy meant in the moments that mattered. Lady Pamela Hicks isn't a tabloid source. She isn't a distant acquaintance or a reconstructed account. She is the daughter of Lord Mountbatten, Edward's first cousin, a woman with direct family access to the Duke in his private distress. Her testimony is the clearest first-person account in the record of what the Donahue years did to Edward. Jimmy himself claimed a 4-year affair. He claimed this to people around him, and those people repeated it. Lady Pamela Hicks, per the record, endorsed it. Christopher Wilson built a book around it. Charles Hyam reversed its direction. Andrew Morton hedged it. Andrew Lowney accepted it. The biographers don't agree and haven't agreed for more than 2 decades. The shape of the record is the point. What the evidence does support, clearly and across independent sources, is this. For approximately 4 years in the early 1950s, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor spent an extraordinary amount of time in Jimmy Donahue's company, much of it financed directly or indirectly by the Donahue family's money. The Duke was distressed by the relationship, distressed enough to weep about it to a family member. Wallis was, by various accounts, revitalized by it. The arrangement served both Windsors and the Donahues in different ways. When it ended sometime around 1954, it ended badly, though the precise circumstances remain disputed. One account describes Jimmy kicking Wallace in the shin during a quarrel, drawing blood, after which the contact ended abruptly and completely. This version comes from a single historian and lacks corroboration from Wilson or Lowney. Wilson describes gradual deterioration. Lowney centers the El Morocco humiliation as the breaking point, after which the Duke ordered contact severed. These 3 accounts aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. A long, slow deterioration, a public humiliation, a final quarrel. That is a plausible sequence, even if no single account of it can be independently verified. What came after the Donahue years is its own kind of evidence. Jimmy Donahue died on December 6, 1966, at 834 Fifth Avenue in New York, found by his mother Jessie. The New York City medical examiner recorded acute alcoholic and barbiturate, specifically seconal, intoxication. He was 51. The New York Times initial death notice described the cause as apparently natural, pending examination. A subsequent Times article attributed it to the medical examiner's finding. His friends believed he had killed himself over an unrequited homosexual love, though this is their interpretation rather than the official record. After his death, 13 framed photographs of Wallace Simpson were found in his bedroom. 13 photographs. Framed and placed, not stored in a drawer, not stacked in a box, but hung or stood on surfaces as objects of deliberate attention. In the bedroom of a man who had been dead to the Windsor household for more than a decade, the woman who had been part of those 4 years still occupied the walls. Whatever the precise nature of what passed between them, something of it persisted in him until the end. The photographs don't explain themselves, they only confirm that he held on to it, that the relationship, whatever it had been, was the thing he kept. The Windsors continued their Paris existence through the 1960s and into the 1970s. The gold notebook remained in use. The dinner protocols held. Guests at 8:45, seated at 9:15. Soup never served. The linens matched to the porcelain. The footmen in livery. Edward died of throat cancer at Villa Windsor on May 28, 1972. He was 77. Wallis was with him at the end. After his death, the last years were bleak. Arteriosclerosis-linked confusion took hold gradually through the 1970s. By 1980, Wallis had lost the power of speech. She spent her final years bedridden, under the control of her French lawyer, Suzanne Bloom, who guarded access to her jealously, let almost no one in, and appointed her own assistant, Michael Bloch, as the Duchess's official biographer. Hugo Vickers, the royal biographer who had the most detailed physical access to Villa Windsor and its contents, later described the final years in terms that left little softness intact. Wallis died at Villa Windsor on April 24, 1986, of bronchial pneumonia. She was 89. The staff still called her Your Royal Highness. It was a rule of the house until the end. Now return to the gold notebook. Wallis grading the dinner, the wines, the sauces, the pastries, the seating. The precision of a woman still running a court that has no kingdom. Still noting what the occasion demanded. Still holding the performance together by documentation. The straight line from Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, to that dinner table in the Bois de Boulogne runs through 40 years of the same skill set, deployed in the same direction. The drawing rooms of Baltimore and the Oldfield School taught her how to make a room work for her. Win Spencer and Ernest Simpson taught her what happened to a woman of that skill set when the supporting structures failed. The Prince of Wales and Fort Belvadier gave her the largest theater she would ever occupy, and then exile, and then the gold notebook, and the grumble book, and the table set for 10, and the footmen in livery, and Jimmy Donahue arriving with his mother's money and his own wit and his capacity to make the evening feel like something was actually happening. What Donahue provided to the Windsor household can't be summarized as seduction or as scandal, without losing the thing that actually made it significant. He wasn't interrupting a happy marriage. He arrived into an arrangement that had, by the early 1950s, developed the specific character of a successful but exhausted enterprise. Still functioning, still impressive from the outside, but running on performance rather than on genuine feeling. Edward had needed someone to keep the party going since the Fort Belvedere days, and Wallis had filled that role. Had filled it at personal cost, filling it still. grading the evenings in the gold notebook because the evenings still had to be worth grading. Jimmy could do what she no longer could. He could be the guest at the table rather than the person responsible for the table, could bring the noise and energy and reckless generosity of someone who had nothing to maintain and nothing to protect. He was, in the most literal sense, the person who kept the lights on in the Donahue years. He paid, he performed, he made the evenings worth attending, and in doing so, he revealed, simply by being necessary, what the marriage had become. The romantic version of the Windsor story, the broadcast speech, the throne sacrificed, the love that cost a crown, has no room in it for Jimmy Donahue. He's an awkward footnote, a salacious sidebar, a problem to route around. Most Windsor biographies handle him in a paragraph or two, a friendship that got inappropriate, then onward. This handling is itself the most revealing fact about how the story has been managed. Because what Donahue's presence actually demonstrates, looked at steadily, is that by its second decade, the marriage required an outsider's money and energy to sustain. The love that had cost a throne was, by the time of the El Morocco paper crowns, something that needed to be kept alive by external supply. The standard Windsor biography answers this by pivoting to devotion. The Duke's bedroom covered in Wallis's photographs, the extraordinary loyalty that persisted through exile and humiliation. And that devotion was real. It's documented in objects, confirmed by people who saw the house. The pictures of Wallace stacked on every surface in Edward's room at Villa Windsor speak to something genuine, a fixation that persisted until his death. But devotion isn't the same as companionship. It isn't amusement. It isn't what makes a restless, easily bored man feel alive in a room on a Tuesday evening in Paris. Wallis herself had named the problem, in the quip recorded in Christopher Wilson's book that she had married the Duke for better or worse, but not for lunch. The joke cuts in two directions simultaneously. It's funny because it's accurate, and it's devastating because she said it. This wasn't a woman describing a love affair. This was a woman describing the daily texture of a life she had not fully chosen, but couldn't exit. With a man whose devoted helplessness had become, by the 1950s, one of the structural facts of her existence. Jimmy Donahue filled the space that created. He gave Wallis something Edward's devotion couldn't supply. The experience of being pursued by someone who had no need of her in return, no structural dependence on her management, no helplessness to absorb. Whether that pursuit crossed into physical territory is what the biographers have argued about for 25 years without resolution. Lady Pamela Hicks says it did, in effect, by endorsing Jimmy's claim. Andrew Morton says the emotional truth was there and the physical fact wasn't. Charles Hyam says it went the other way entirely and involved the Duke. Andrew Lowney says the humiliation was real, and the affair was real, and the Duke knew it. The triangle doesn't resolve. It was unresolved when it happened, in the early 1950s, in the dinner parties and the Atlantic crossings and the nightclub tables, and it has remained unresolved in every biography since. This is the shape of the evidence, and the shape of the evidence is itself the answer to a question the story keeps posing. What actually was the Windsor marriage? The answer that emerges from the Donahue years isn't the romantic one. It's this: a partnership between two people who had each, in different ways, built their lives around the other. Edward out of devotion, Wallis out of necessity, and who, by the 1950s, needed a third party to keep the arrangement livable. What the third party wanted is still unclear. 13 photographs after his death suggest something endured in Jimmy that didn't require reciprocity to survive. He was 51 when he died. He had spent the last decade of his life without the Windsors, without the funded excursions and the champagne and the table set for 10, without the role of amuser-in-chief to the world's most famous exiles. He had spent it the way he'd spent everything before the Windsors, at expensive hotels with a valet, sustained by his mother's money, without employment or purpose. The seconal and the alcohol weren't new elements in his life by December 1966. They were the continuation of a trajectory that had been visible for years. Jessie Donahue survived her son. She lived until 1971. When told of Jimmy's death, she reportedly said, "This is the worst thing that can happen to me." She had lost her last son. Woolworth, Wooly Donahue had died before her. She had arranged his public appearances with female escorts to protect his reputation. She had kept the purse strings tight enough that even Jimmy's access to the Woolworth fortune depended on her continued approval. She had traded a chunk of that fortune for access to the Windsors, and the access had given her the social position she'd spent her life trying to purchase. What she felt about the specific nature of what Jimmy had been to the Windsors, or they to him, isn't in the record. The record closes, as records of this kind tend to, on objects. 13 photographs in a dead man's bedroom, a gold notebook beside a plate, a former king's abdication desk, sold at Sotheby's, New York in February 1998, along with 3,200 lots of Windsor possessions, to a crowd of bidders who paid $23 million for the remnants of a life. Edward's visitor's book from Fort Belvadier, which he'd kept through every subsequent home he shared with Wallace, was among the contents. He had carried the record of those Fort Belvedere weekends into exile, through the Bahamas, through the post-war nomadic years, all the way to Villa Windsor. The record of who had been at the table when the evenings were worth attending. The romance sold to the world as the sacrifice of a century was, by Paris, a gilded dependency. Two people who had built a life around mutual need, one of devotion and one of managed necessity, who found by the early 1950s that the life required outside assistance to maintain the appearance it had always presented. Jimmy Donahue provided that assistance for approximately 4 years. He was charming and cruel, and generous and attached, in ways the biographers still argue about, to both of them. He took the laugh at El Morocco. He left the photographs on the walls. The third man at that table wasn't a footnote to the love story. He was the proof that by the time he arrived, there wasn't as much of one left as the world had been told. If you want more documentary history told this way, subscribe.